Hey class, this is going to be our second lecture today, looking at Chapter 8, Training for Speed and Power. So I'm going to share my screen with you here again real quick. There we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about training for speed and power. And we're going to first talk about is Aaron Donald here. So very briefly, if you're not familiar with Aaron Donald is probably the best defensive player to ever play in the National Football League. And when he first came into the league, however, people kind of had a gripe with his size and with his stature, just because he wasn't likely going to be large enough to therefore to generate enough force and be good enough on the defensive line. Now, what they didn't find out until later was that he's likely or almost certainly the most powerful person to ever play in the National Football League. He developed a lot of force in a very short period of time, which allowed him to be very successful on the defensive line for the Los Angeles Rams. When we talk about power, power is force times velocity. Force is just mass times acceleration, so and the velocity is distance over time. And so if you can move something that's really heavy, really fast, you can have lots of power. Or if you can move something that's really, really, really heavy in a short period of time, lots of power. Or something that's really just something in general, you can move it that's a very heavy and you can move it very fast, that is also likely going to be lots of power. But keeping in mind, the longer it takes you, essentially the lower the power function becomes. So we talk about power in sports, there's a balance between force and velocity. More muscles can generate more force, but increased mass is harder to move. And so when you look at specific sports, certain sports will have different body sizes for the necessity of their sport. On the right there, you see long distance cycling, and you see this individual is smaller in general, but especially smaller quads. Now you look at this speed biker on the left side, and they are much heavier and much larger, and they can produce much higher amounts of peak power. Now, the person on the right will have decent hypertrophy as well, will have good aerobic adaptations. The person on the left, obviously, we are seeing massive anaerobic adaptations. Speed and power, right? So speed, rate of motion, power is a function of force times distance over time. And so again, the heavier the thing is, the farther you can move it in a short period of time, you're going to be eliciting more power. So briefly, what we're going to talk about here is the force, velocity, and power relationships. Remember, we talked about as you increase the velocity of a movement, it becomes much more difficult to produce a lot of force because you're not getting efficient crossover of the actin and myosin leading into a less efficient force production capacity. So you've felt this before, and this is something that is commonplace in every single movement that you do. Really heavy things are really hard to lift fast because the only possible way for you to develop enough force to lift that really heavy thing is to be moving slowly. If you were to move faster, you would not be capable of developing that force, and therefore you would be enough to be able to move the object. Now, in power, typically peak power occurs somewhere in the middle of maximal force and maximal velocity. Now, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it's joint angle specific, it's movement specific, it's anthropometric specific, but for the most part, typically most movements, peak power occurs somewhere in the middle of peak force and peak velocity. So if you're going to train for speed and power, the goal is to stress the mechanisms that produce ATP at a very fast rate. So this is relatively obvious. This is the type of training that you typically do for anaerobic training. You're trying to get stronger muscles, bigger muscles, greater ATP production, stronger bones, faster reaction time in terms of muscular reaction, increased agility. You're going to be doing things that stress all of those systems, that stress your capacity to produce force very quickly, i.e., produce ATP very quickly, which is what training for speed and power really is all about. Now, another thing is called the power duration relationship, and this is relatively self-explanatory. The idea that you can't maintain maximal power over time, just like you can't maintain maximal force output for a very long period of time. And so typically what you'll really see is individuals' power curves or their power output will follow something called a critical power curve. And so individuals, when they're going through power outputs, they will have a spike in power, but typically you'll have this kind of gradual drop off at the end. And if it was some sort of maximal assessment, really what you'll see is kind of a gradual drop off in this kind of hyperbolic sense here, this kind of curve. And then you'll see a gradual plateau of their power output. And that's called critical power. It's not shown in this graph here. It's shown more in this graph right here. So typically you see that maximal power, and then you see kind of this plateau, and that's your maximal aerobic power. Spike here, though, is really the type of power that we're talking about because this is the powerful movements that we need for our power required sports. Talked about before, just real quick, that power is position specific, and this kind of has to do with the length tension relationship as well as the ascending and descending force curves. So different movements will have different peak power depending on force and velocity. But again, typically, most of the time, peak power curves somewhere in between for peak force and peak velocity, typically closer to the middle. You're gonna have a much higher concentration of movements that are at peak power somewhere in this middle third as opposed to the top or the bottom thirds. And the biggest thing here is talking about rate of force development. So I'm going to ask you this question to think about it as a class or at home. When I ask you which athlete has the better force profile. So, athlete A, we see individual is spiking right here and then kind of plateauing sooner, while individual B is not spiking quite as quickly, but is ending at a higher peak force output. So the rate of force development is not high. So which athlete has a better force profile? Which one of these athletes would be better at sports? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think about it, see what your answer might be. And the answer really is it depends. So it depends on what your sport is. If the sport that you're doing requires you to have very explosive movements that take less than 100 milliseconds, so change of direction, running, sprinting, jumping, whatever it might be, or not really jumping, but sprinting, individual A is going to have a better force curve. They are getting to a higher echelon of force much, much sooner. So any movement less than 100 milliseconds, individual A will be more powerful and develop more force. Now, anything that takes longer than 100 milliseconds, like a vertical jump or some sort of sustained movement, individual B would have a better force output. Even though they're not developing force as quickly, they are still maintaining force production increases past 100 milliseconds. So anything past 100 milliseconds, able to develop more force and therefore likely better at whatever that required task is. So question here again, are the classic strength lifts the best way to produce power? So like a classic squat, a classic bench press, a classic deadlift, are those really the best way to train power? So we'll talk about bar velocity comparison, bench press versus a bench press throw. So I'm going to turn this volume down here so you can see it here. A bench press throw. So our individual here is going to grab the bar and he's going to throw the bar up. And so that might look dumb. You may be looking at that and going, well, that's really, really dumb. Why would anyone ever do that? But what we're seeing here in a bench press throw, so in a bench press throw, you are seeing the velocity of the movement continuing to increase all the way throughout the range of motion. While in a traditional bench press, the velocity of the movement is increasing about the midpoint of the motion and then decreasing. And so in a traditional bench press, because you're not moving with maximal velocity intent throughout the entire range of motion, the transfer to sport is not super great. If I want to be pushing off of somebody as hard as I can, say I need to extend through a blocker, you don't go to maximal velocity until you get halfway and then slow down and push them. You're pushing maximal velocity all the way through that individual. So this maintains the same way for a bench press throw. You are maintaining maximal velocity all the way through the motion, which is going to have more transfer to sports. Now, bench press throw isn't the most commonly utilized one. There's a little bit better ways to go about this, but this is really, really good when we talk about power cleans or jump squats. In a power clean or a jump squat, you are maintaining maximal velocity intent. You are trying to continually increase velocity all the way throughout the range of motion. So again, you think about a traditional back squat, your peak velocity of the back squat is going to be likely somewhere around the middle. But as you get closer to the top portion of the back squat, you need to begin to decelerate. And that's what you do in a back squat, is you decelerate near the very top. But if you're jumping or you're trying to push somebody in sport again, you're not decelerating just as you're about to make contact with them. You are accelerating all the way through contact point and hopefully through that contact point even further. And so these non-traditional or these Olympic lifts typically are what are going to elicit the greatest power or the most robust power adaptations. And these are the ones that are going to be more commonly utilized in power specific sports. So we look at the power output realistically, a snatch or a clean generates a lot more power in individuals. If you're trying to train specifically for power, you need to be stressing the systems of power, your ability to develop force very quickly over a short period of time. Now, to analyze power, you can do something called velocity-based training. And so typically when we talk about training, we'll talk about volumes versus reps or rest times or whatever it might be. This is pretty good for measuring training over time. And if you're doing, let's say, 5x10s, and one day you just feel like, oh man, I can't get that last couple reps on my fifth set, maybe you think, okay, maybe I should roll back training a little bit. Maybe I should have a little bit more recovery. Maybe I should pull back the weight a little bit. Something like that kind of gives you an idea that you may be overtraining or you may need more rest time. Now, with velocity-based training, this is kind of a way to measure the quality of individual reps. And so instead of just measuring the total amount of reps that you can do, what you can do is you can get a baseline of the velocity of movements. And this allows for a little bit more precise tracking of your recovery or your training over time. If you were seeing that sets 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you're averaging a certain speed throughout the entire set or a certain speed on certain reps. And then you go through rigorous training and you come back a month later and do this again, and you see that the individual is failing to reach the same velocity that they were before. Maybe they're overtraining a little bit, need to pull back a little bit, or maybe the training that you're giving them is not hitting the mark. Maybe the velocity component of your training is missing and you need to focus more on velocity. Now, again, this allows for a little bit more robust or precise examination of training or of what you're doing. And so what you can do with this is, okay, you're able to lift 5x10, but how fast can you move the bar through that 5x10? Is your power training really working? And so with velocity-based training, with this band tied to the bar, we can say, okay, great, you can do 5x10, but compared to 6 months ago, you're moving 15% faster. And so that's saying that our power type training is doing what we want it to do. Go through this velocity-based training. Great. So our main adaptations of speed and power training, this really should be a lot of review. We're seeing an increased production of ATP at a higher rate. You're able to sustain that production rate for a longer time, generate more force in the process, recruit more motor units, and increase myofibril content in the muscle. All of these things are going to increase the power gain. These are very similar to strength and hypertrophy, but the important thing here is the rate at which you can produce force and at which you can produce ATP. Again, a lot of the very similar adaptations to strength and hypertrophy training. We're going to see fiber type shift, maybe a little bit more types towards type 2X now. This is a more intense type training that requires faster force production. So with faster force production, you're going to shift a little bit more maybe towards type 2X. But in general, increased anaerobic enzymes, increased neural adaptation, increased buffering and capacity, all these things allowing you to generate more power. So really also what you're seeing here is part of the neuromuscular component is that these individuals are not only generating force more quickly within the muscle, but their neural drive and the neural components are more precise at high speeds. Remember that the neuromuscular component, you need to train the body to do things. It seems obvious because it's a motion, but we think about something like, let's say, a basketball shot. If you've never shot a basketball before, you're not going to be very good at it. Now, you can mimic the motion. It's pretty easy to mimic that motion, but to do it precisely so that you can make a shot takes a lot of practice. The same thing goes for any basic movement in the body. Yes, you can mimic the movement of a power clean, but for you to do it with maximal efficiency, you need to practice and you need to train doing that movement. And over time, not only will you see adaptations in the muscle, but you also see neural adaptations that allows you to be more efficient and the timing and the specificity of muscle firing groups, in essence, making the overall motion much, much more efficient, which will lead to a more powerful movement. So something else we'll talk about is a stretch shortening cycle. So this has to do with muscle spindles. And so there's a little bit of mixed literature on what the stretch shortening cycle is, but essentially what it's saying is that as you go into a counter movement of, let's say, a jump, you're getting a pre-stretch of the muscular components. All the muscular components within the body and the tendons have an ability to stretch. So if you stretch them and then release them at just the right time, you'll get an elastic recoil. And this is part of the reason that allows for a counter movement jump, so movement down and then up, which allows for a higher jump than just a movement from here up. And so that stretch shortening cycle helps out. And part of what this is the idea of muscle spindles. Now, muscle spindles are not to be confused with the Golgi tendon organ. They do similar but kind of opposite things. Muscle spindles measure or examine or are sensitive to the stretch of the muscle. So not necessarily the force on the muscle, but the stretch of the muscle. And so when the muscle senses or the spindle senses stretch, it'll actually provide an agonist movement or it entices the muscle to contract. And so if that muscle stretches real quick, actually the response is to contract in a way to protect the muscle. And this is what the patellar tendon reflex is at the bottom here. When you hit the patellar tendon, it really quickly shortens the distal portion of the rectus femoris, and that really quick stretch stimulates a response in the rectus femoris to go through contraction, and that's what lifts your leg in the patellar tendon reflex right there. And so this is part of the reason that the stretch shortening cycle exists. Now, again, it's a lot more complicated than that. And it actually has a lot more to do with your eccentric capacity to develop force and the amortization of force back into a concentric motion. We're not going to get that far into it, but you should know that some of the elastic component of the muscles and of the tendons allows for a counter movement to lead to a higher jump. We're talking about plyometric training. So what plyometric training is really trying to do is really stress that stretch shortening cycle and really stress that transfer from eccentric into concentric. Again, we talk about specificity. Specificity is in this component or in this aptitude, really talking about your ability to transfer force really, really quickly. And so in addition to training neuromuscular and muscular adaptations, something that you can do to further enhance those adaptations is to try to shorten the amount of time that they can actually manifest or they can occur. And so what you can do is this plyometric style training where the intent of this training is to change direction as fast as possible. Sure, being stronger will help you change direction. Sure, having more ATP and a faster production of ATP will help you change direction. But there's also, again, a velocity component to it. So if you can stress the velocity in which you change direction and you produce force, this can also help you with power training. I talked about this in the last chapter, muscle tendon stiffness. Typically, if you go through plyometric training, the tendons themselves will become more stiff, which will allow more of a transfer of force between the muscle and the bone, which means more quick compliance, which means more quick or quicker change of direction. Now, another thing we'll talk about is actually called post-activation potentiation. And I'll skip to this graph. Really what post-activation potentiation is saying is that when you do some sort of near maximal movement, it actually potentiates or prepares you for some sort of other dynamic motion. And so what we're really seeing here is individuals with jump A, individuals in group A, do some counter movement jumps. They take an 8-minute break and then they do other counter movement jumps. Now, in jump B, our individuals do counter movement jumps. They take a 4-minute break. They do a 5 RM and then they do take a 4-minute break. And then they do counter movement jumps again. And so you have that same relative 8-minute break in between or so. But what you're seeing in jump B is that individuals actually jump higher, significantly higher in that post-jumping time. And what this really is in a very basic sense is that the potentiation or the exertion of the muscle in between these two counter movements essentially does a variety of different physiological perturbations to lead to an increased preparation for the next motion. Now, there is a whole host of different literature stating why or why not this occurs. And what I want to say with this too is that this is time sensitive. So you can't just go in the morning and do a maximal lift and then expect to be able to jump higher later in the day or be better at your sport. You have to keep in mind too, there's also fatigue, there's also muscle damage. And also, if this potentiation time, if this time between the 5 RM squat and the counter movement jump was maybe expanded to a half an hour or an hour, the potentiation may not be as good as well. And again, there's a whole host of different literature and different ideas in this, but this is something that is kind of emerging as a potential way to increase or in a short manner, increase power production during a specific event. So we talk about correlation. So we talk about the correlation between vertical jump and sprint times. Now, you may be thinking, okay, vertical jump and sprint, relatively similar, but one's vertical and one's horizontal, so they would have reasonably good correlation. Well, what we're seeing here is that they have very strong correlation. And so what this means here is negative 0.77. Remember, if you know correlation can only go up to one or negative one. So what this is saying is as your jump height gets higher, your 10-meter time gets shorter or lower, or as your 10-meter time gets shorter, your jump height is higher. And so just because it says that there's negative here doesn't mean that these things aren't correlated in the way that you think they would be. And that would make sense. If you are more explosive in a vertical direction, you're likely going to be more explosive in a horizontal direction. Now, specifically with a 10-meter sprint as opposed to a 40-meter sprint, there begins to be a greater horizontal capacity in the 40-meter sprint. But the main force producing vector of all movements on our feet is always a vertical ground reaction force. If the horizontal force that you're trying to produce is greater than the vertical ground reaction force, you're going to slip. And so having a lot of vertical ground reaction force, being able to produce force in the vertical plane, as opposed to just a horizontal plane, really helps you. So as you train more, as you train this vertical ground reaction force, like you do doing a squat or doing a vertical jump, this will then in turn allow you to produce more horizontal force over time, which means that you can likely sprint faster or do whatever you may need to do. Now, upper body power, relatively common nowadays. A lot of it is using med ball throws. We talked about the bench press throw. Typically, med ball throws is how you'll see a lot of upper body power. And again, the idea is maximal velocity intent, maximal force intent all the way throughout the range of motion. So next we'll talk about speed and agility. And so when we talk about speed and agility, these things are different. And so speed is essentially rate of change of position. So how fast can you move? So if you can go from one position to another position in a straight line, typically that's very high speed. But in terms of agility, agility has a lot more components involved, and typically agility has a lot more to do with acceleration. And so if you're a very agile person, typically you're very fast. If you're a very fast person, typically you're very agile. But when you talk about agility and speed separately, you can have individuals that are more agile or have better top speed. So if we look at someone like Usain Bolt used to be the greatest sprinter in the world. You watch him run. Oh, let's see if it works. It's not going to work. Of course, it's not. So if you watch Usain Bolt run, what you'll really see, let's see if it works now, is actually he does not start off overly fast. So Usain Bolt used to get kind of a lot of grief because the worst part of his running was his start. He wasn't very agile. Even though he was the fastest man in the world, because he was so tall, it was very, very difficult for him to be very agile. And so you'll kind of see typically your smaller individuals, like we'll talk about Saquon Barkley in a little bit, are much more agile individuals because body size, body composition, and anthropometrics play a large role in agility. Speed, really just stride length, stride rate. We talked about this before. The reason that Usain Bolt was the fastest man in the world, the main genetic predisposition that made him the fastest man in the world was because he was so tall. He had the same stride rate as everyone else, but his stride lengths were longer because he was taller, which led to a faster speed on the track. Talking about agility, so we're seeing Saquon Barkley here, Adrian Peterson. So agility can be viewed as an athlete's collective coordinative abilities. So adaptive ability, their balance, their coordination, their orientation, their reactiveness, their rhythm, all these things play into agility. Agility is an exceptionally complex physiological component of movement and sport. And there's a variety of different approaches that you can make to increasing agility. So we're looking at this, and this is a lot. You're not going to need to have this memorized. What I'm really trying to show you here, though, is that there is a whole variety, a plethora of different mechanisms that are responsible for increased agility. And so typically, if you want to become a more agile person, you have to train one of these in which you're lacking or create a training program that stresses every single component of agility. So that's the end of the lecture. I know I'm going through this pretty quick, but for the most part, most of this should be review. This is not a textbook that I get to choose. One of the upper level faculty choose this, and then I also just teach the other version of Exercise Physiology 1. So I'm not a huge fan of this textbook and of this chapter, but this gives us a little bit more applied or more application of the things that we have been talking about over the last few weeks. But otherwise, I will see you guys hopefully back in class on Monday, And I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.